Thank you so very much. Thanks for this invitation, and thanks for that generous introduction. I must say, it's a pleasure to be back in a democratic country. Even with a smudge of blackface. We in the United States and much of the West have been undergoing a crisis of democracy at least as grave as that of the 1930s. Some scholars last year wrote a paper pointing out that despite the severity of the Great Depression, only one country elected a fascist government in the 1930s, and that, of course, was Germany. All the other countries that fell to fascism fell either to invasions or to coups d'etat. And Germany, when you think about it, was weighted down by the legacy of the Versailles reparations, by the hyperinflation of 1923, by the austerity demands that were still being imposed by Germany's international creditors right up until the election that brought the Nazi party to power in January of 1933. The predecessor coalition government was carrying out the austerity economics that were demanded by Germany's international creditors. So in some respects, because the depression that we're experiencing is hidden, it's a 40-year depression in the living standards and life chances of ordinary people, it's even more alarming that in country after country, beginning with the United States of America and the British catastrophe over Brexit, and Orban and Erdogan and Kaczynski, and all of the other leaders who are either neo-fascists or having to reckon with popular votes in favor of the far nationalist right. And as Ed Broadbent suggested, this is the direct result of the capture of our politics by neoliberal ideology and neoliberal policies, where center-left parties have indeed been complicit. There was a moment in the late 1990s where most of the nations of the West were governed by nominally center-left parties. And the trinity, the unholy trinity of Clinton and Blair and Schroeder almost outdid the right in their embrace of neoliberal policies. So when voters looked at Hillary Clinton in 2016, taking $500,000 honoraria per speech from Wall Street, and they looked at the mainstream Republicans doing worse, they concluded that why not just vote for somebody who's going to blow the whole thing up, because that might be better than what we've got. Today's version of globalization is profoundly anti-democratic. And I want to take us back a little later in this talk to 1944, because 1944 demonstrates that that is not the only possible version of globalization. You can have a globalization that makes it possible to leash finance rather than allowing finance to become the master of the whole system. But today's version of globalization, on the one flank, uses global trade agreements to narrow the space for national policy and weaken government's ability to housebreak capitalism. And on the other flank, the popular revulsion against the results of globalization bring to power people like Donald Trump. And as Ed said, democracy inheres in the polity, in the nation state. Global government is a very nice ideal, and we have to think of ourselves as globalists in the best sense when we think about climate change and human rights. But policies have to be made nationally, because that's where democracy exists. As a citizen of the United States of America, I can vote for my leaders. My government has certain rules and procedures that are relatively transparent and that can be contested. I am not a citizen of the Republic of NAFTA. much less the Republic of the World Trade Organization. There's no global government, there's no global citizenship, there's no global lender of last resort, no global antitrust authority, no global tax collector, no global Securities and Exchange Commission. And globalization has been used, certainly for the past 20 years, to reinforce the power of finance to deregulate capitalism domestically, which is really the only venue in which capitalism can be regulated. Now, it's true that institutions such as those that were created at Bretton Woods can allow governments to establish rules to constrain finance internationally, but those governments have to be elected nationally. And the unraveling of the several elements of the post-war social settlement had several sources. Globalization was not the only element, but it was a key driver, a key instrument, and a key vector of neoliberal ideology. Globalization, as it was defined post-1990, helped restore the power of financial elites that had been very usefully constrained in the early post-war era. And the fact that the same backlash is occurring in all of the Western democracies at the same time is neither a coincidence nor is it an accidental contagion. It is a common reaction of ordinary people against the rules of globalization that have undermined their living standards and their life chances. Far-right sentiments are always lurking around the margins of society. But when you have a period like the period between the 40s and the 60s, when the economy is not only growing, but is growing more equal, the far right doesn't get taken seriously. And that's not accidental either. Globalization also accelerates cross-border movements of people. Corporate leaders and their political allies have promoted international flows of cheap labor. Remittances have become an important source of income in much of the third world. The European Union requires cross-border free movement of workers as a condition of membership. Immigrants are also refugees from wars and from dictators. Now, a few brave progressive national leaders from Sweden to Germany to Canada have opened their doors to immigrants, but many of them have paid a political price because it's hard enough to ask the locals to open their hearts and their borders to refugees when economic times are good. When you're taking away their livelihoods, it's asking too much of them to love their neighbors, especially if their neighbors are culturally different from them. And so the refugee crisis, the immigration crisis, has poured oil on the flames. Now, there's been a long-standing debate about whether capitalism promotes democracy. And the old story was that because of common norms of transparency, the need for the rule of law, and free competition for markets, for ideas, and for votes, that free market capitalism and democracy were natural allies. Now, if you look at the actual history of the West, democracy has expanded by limiting the power of capitalists. And when that project fails, dark forces are unleashed. For much of the 20th century and into the 21st century, capitalism has coexisted all too nicely with dictatorships, which conveniently create friendly business climates and repress worker organizations. Communist China works hand in glove with Western industry to repress independent trade unions. And Vladimir Putin has a very nice alliance with Soviet kleptocrats, so Russian kleptocrats. So I published a book on all this last April called Can Democracy Survive Global Capitalism? And if somebody had published a book with that title in the prematurely triumphalist year of 1989, it would have been a complete head-scratcher because, of course, the common view was democracy and capitalism went together. What do you mean, can democracy survive global capitalism? But many serious people, or people who thought they were serious, made the argument that freedom and democracy and capitalism go together. Two of the best known are the Friedmans, Milton and Tom. And according to Milton Friedman, capitalism embodies freedom because you're free to pursue your dreams, free perhaps to get rich. And Tom Friedman of the New York Times, no relation to Milton, has argued that capitalism promotes peace since free markets require an absence of military conflict. Friedman even proposed what he called the McDonald's rule, that no two countries with McDonald's fast food restaurants have ever gone to war together. Well, that held only until the Yugoslav Civil War, where several McDonald's actually got bombed. But in this view, the enemy of both kinds of freedom, economic freedom and political freedom, is the state. And Hayek wrote this in his classic 1944 book, The Road to Serfdom. Hayek lumped social democracy with totalitarianism, arguing that it was only a matter of time before seemingly benign state-sponsored programs mutated into full-blown tyranny and citizens became serfs. So here's the problem. Here's one of the many problems with that story. There is literally not a single case on record where social democracy or Roosevelt-style progressivism has mutated into full-blown tyranny. But there are many cases in which free market capitalism, because of the gross insecurity that it engendered, created backlashes that did create tyranny. The true prophet here, with a nod to Kari, is Karl Polanyi, who in many respects was a better guide to these dynamics than the other Karl Marx. Now, in fairness, Polanyi had almost another century of history to draw upon, but rather than the workers of the world uniting, Polanyi taught, what happens is the workers of the world, when times get tough, turn to ultranationalism and to fascism. And Polanyi was prophetic in three different eras. He warned what was coming in the 1930s. He wrote about it retrospectively in The Great Transformation. He lived to see capitalism harnessed by popular forces in the broad public interest in the 40s through the 60s. And although post-war social democracy was not nearly as socialist as Polanyi would have liked, it did bring prosperity to the broad working class, and it did keep fascism at bay. And of course, once again, Polanyi is a prophet for our own era as we repeat the patterns of the 1920s and the 1930s. And please note, I am not saying as we repeat the mistakes of the 1920s and the 1930s, because the resurrection of raw capitalism and the overthrow of countervailing democratic constraints was no accident. It was quite deliberate. It was intrinsic to the system. Second regard in which Polanyi is more instructive than Marx, Marx tended to see the unfolding of history as in terms of laws. Polanyi had a more hopeful, a more contingent view of history. Capitalism certainly had propensities that were at risk of repeating themselves. The rigidity of the gold standard was recapitulated in the austerity of the European Union. The demand of the early 19th century that labor find its price on the market is being repeated in the assault on trade unions and the deregulation of labor standards. Free trade, then as now, is defined in a way that serves capital, weakens labor, and undermines the national project of taming capitalism in the broad public interest. These were the three fundamentals of 19th century liberalism that Polanyi saw as destroying society, and their counterparts are being replicated now. But, as I say, Polanyi saw these as tendencies, not as iron rules. He left room for human agency. He left room for democratic politics. He left room for hope. And in my book and my other work, I took a very close look at what happened in the 1930s and the 1940s. Now, most of us, I think, grew up thinking of the post-war social settlement as normal. We had learned from the mistakes of policy. We had harnessed raw capitalism, particularly financial capitalism, which almost became a public utility thanks to the regulation of the 1930s and the 1940s. We empowered labor through strong unions, and for the first time, really the only time in the history of this difficult marriage between capitalism and democracy, the state either sided with trade unions or with workers' rights to organize trade unions, or at worst was benignly neutral. And the result was unparalleled prosperity and unparalleled stability. There were no crises, no serious financial collapses during this period. And so we concluded, okay, this is the new normal. Well, turns out that that victory was much more contingent and much more the result of some fortuitous accidents than we would like to believe. And there was a famous argument between Keynes and his collaborator and protege, Michal Kalecki, who located himself somewhere between Keynes and Marx. And Kalecki, in a famous article, wrote that as a matter of technical economics, Keynes was right. You could stabilize capitalism with judicious macroeconomic policies and regulatory policies. But, said Kalecki, as a matter of politics, the capitalists will never let you do it. Now, when I was young and in graduate school and looking back on this history, it looked to me as if Keynes had won the argument. You know, 1960s, everything's just ducky. But with the benefit of 50-year, or the tragedy of 50 years more history, looks to me increasingly like Kalecki won the argument. That even though as a matter of technical economics you can stabilize capitalism, the capitalists are going to put up one hell of a resistance. And I don't think I've become more Marxian in the last 50 years. I think the world has become more Marxian. Okay? So looking back at this period of a kind of harmonic convergence that allowed us to create a kind of managed form of capitalism, a mixed economy. What were the ingredients of that, and how might we find our way back to something similar? Because we today need a set of controls on capital and a strategy for empowering labor and a strategy for reclaiming the ability of the state to manage the whole show, at least as radical as those of Roosevelt and Bretton Woods, which I'll get to in a moment. Well, it took a fair amount of luck. I believe that history is a mixture of laws or tendencies and a dose of luck. There's a lot of contingency to history. So for starters, Roosevelt got elected. It wasn't guaranteed that somebody as left-wing as Roosevelt would get elected out of the crisis of the Great Depression. And there was a horrible moment in February of 1933 when Roosevelt was president-elect, and he was attending a rally in Miami, and an assassin, an anarchist named Joe Zangara, got within about 10 feet of Roosevelt, fired 7 shots, hit the mayor of Chicago instead. And if Zangara's aim had been true, the President of the United States in the Great Depression would have been a non-entity from Texas named Texas Jack Garner, who was put on the ticket for purposes of balancing the ticket and giving Roosevelt enough delegates to get elected. And Garner is famous for one thing. He's famous for saying that the vice presidency is not worth a bucket of warm spit, except he didn't say spit. They cleaned it up so it could be published in a family newspaper. So the fact that Roosevelt not only got elected and survived that assassination attempt, but turned out to be a lot more radical than a lot of people expected, that was dumb luck. The fact that Roosevelt rejected efforts by a lot of serious people to urge him to govern as a dictator. That was also kind of fortunate. And then if you go forward about 10 years, you have this harmonic convergence on both sides of the Atlantic, where the right wing has ceased to exist. The nationalist right wing has been discredited by the war. The great statesmen who brought us the period of European union and European prosperity realized that in order to head off a third European civil war, there needed to be pan-European institutions that believed in full employment. They understood the connection between mass unemployment and the rise of fascism. You also had this happy convergence where Keynes was the chair of the Bretton Woods Conference. And the Bretton Woods system was Keynes's effort to learn from the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles, which had thrust him into prominence, and create an international system that was the global part of a domestic New Deal, where the rules of the game would constrain speculative finance and not allow an end run to international financial markets to undermine the ability of individual nations to leash finance so that its toxic effects would not be loosed on the economy. And although Keynes's design for Bretton Woods was not the design that was carried out, the reality was close enough. I mean, Bancor, Keynes's idea for an international currency, that never came about, but the dollar served that role for a while. And the other two key things about Bretton Woods that allowed nations to pursue national policies that were progressive policies were the fact that exchange rates were fixed and that there were capital controls. And that meant that an entire way of life that is now common on Wall Street didn't exist. You could not have speculation in exchange rates because exchange rates were fixed. You could not have the kinds of toxic financial instruments that we have today that take advantage of international markets because you had capital controls. And so I have a chapter in my book called A Tale of Two Socialists. And the first of the two socialists is Clement Attlee. So Attlee comes to power in July of 1945 when the British debt to GDP ratio is 240%. So if you had today's economic rules and you had a country with a debt ratio of 240%, the IMF, the World Bank, the European Union would direct that country to go into a deep austerity pit. Even Greece never got up to 240% of GDP. What did Attlee do? He built a welfare state. He doubled down on wartime tax rates on rich people. He created the National Health Service. Why didn't the pound crash? Because the rules of the game made it impossible for speculators to crash the pound. Think about that. Now, fast forward to the other socialist, François Mitterrand. Mitterrand becomes a president of France on a very left-wing program in 1981. And he decides, changer la vie, we're going to have massive public spending, we're going to nationalize industries and banks, we're going to have a 37-hour work week, raise taxes on rich people. What happens? International speculative financial markets crash the franc. And then they do it again, and then they do it again. And Mitterrand is reduced to instituting not just capital controls, but controls on French tourists. And the whole thing is a fiasco. And so Mitterrand does a 180. Now, this is not because France in 1981 had an external financial balance worse than Britain in 1945. In fact, France's external balance was exemplary. But it was because speculative finance had been liberated to speculate against countries that have the temerity to pursue progressive programs. And there it is in a nutshell. If you change the rules of the international game, you change the capacity of individual nation states to pursue progressive policies. Now, trade, so-called, is absolutely central to this story because until around 1990, various rounds of trade liberalization had been about reciprocal cuts in tariffs and reductions in some non-tariff barriers. And trade increased dramatically. But nobody tried to tell individual nations what they could and could not do by way of regulating their economy, or what they could and could not do by way of having public ownership, or having regional development policies that involve subsidies. And then after 1990, when the neoliberals, both in the academy and in diplomacy and on Wall Street, really grabbed the trade agenda by the throat, there were all of these new, so-called new trade areas, TRIPS and TROPS and TRIMS, and the basic idea was that anything that is a barrier to free movement of commerce is an interference with trade. And the rules of the WTO become an all-purpose battering ram to destroy the ability of individual nations to regulate their economies. Meanwhile, in another part of the galaxy, the European Union is doing exactly the same thing. Under the Treaty of Maastricht, which is the closest thing the EU has to a constitution, as a member state, you are required to have free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. And over the course of the past 20 years, the European Court of Justice has intervened again and again and again to hold that perfectly reasonable strategies for regulating capitalism violate those principles. And that has undermined trade unionism. It's undermined the ability of nations to set labor standards. One case after another where the mixed economy that we knew in the 40s, 50s, and 60s is found to be inconsistent with European fundamental law. And if that were not enough, the austerity crowd really got control of European monetary and European macro policy. At least in the United States, after the financial collapse of 2008, we had a fairly expansive monetary policy with the various cues. But because the euro is this bizarre currency that reports to whatever it's up to, 17 or 18 different national masters, the lowest common denominator is austerity. And so while the United States had an uneven recovery, but at least it had a recovery, Europe went even deeper into stagnation, which again becomes fuel for the rise of the far right. So clearly we have to take this back. And the circumstances today, I think, are not exactly auspicious because it's hard to think of a left party in Europe that is a plausible leader of this. One of the consequences of the rise of neo-fascism has been the splintering of parliaments in Europe into multi-party affairs where it's almost impossible to have a working majority in behalf of strong government. And so you get drift, you get more and more frustration on the part of the people that the government is not fixing whatever's broken. And in country after country, even when you happen to have social democrats leading the government or in the government, they're dependent on centrist parties for their working majority, which means that they can't pursue social democratic policies. However, I bring you, I think, hopeful news from, of all places, the United States of America, because we actually have not one but two left progressives, one of whom is very, very likely to get the Democratic nomination. And I know Elizabeth Warren very well. I know of no one in American politics who is such a close student of how capitalism actually works, and who is as good at narrating for ordinary people the connection between what has gone on in their own lives and how capitalism has been rigged for the benefit of the most wealthy and the most powerful. Now, it's a long way to the election, but the fact that she has emerged as the front runner for the Democratic nomination, and she has, is nothing short of miraculous. It's also miraculous given the propensity of the Democratic Party to have a demolition derby. It's also miraculous that Warren and Sanders thus far have a kind of non-aggression pact, and they have refrained from attacking each other. That's also a kind of a blessing. So I think if the road, and I don't say this as a patriot or a nationalist, but as an empiricist, I think if the road back to something like the New Deal is going to happen at all, it could well start in the United States. It's the least we owe the rest of the world, having brought the rest of the world this neoliberal horror. So on that note of guarded hope, let me invite discussion and questions. Thanks so much.